I think you as an individual need to push yourself to learn how to adapt your work in the context to the way AI and agents are sort of understand and are good at interacting. And when you do that, you'll see much more effectiveness. And the individuals and the organizations who do that versus those who don't, there may be a 10x spread.
Welcome to Technoventure. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Saam Motamedi. Saam is a partner at Greylock, one of Silicon Valley's most influential venture capital firms, known for backing category-defining technology companies for more than 60 years. Saam focuses on enterprise software and artificial intelligence native companies with a particular interest in platforms that can serve the world's largest global enterprises. He led Greylock's investment in Anthropic, and he's also been an investor and sits on the board of companies like Abnormal AI, Snorkel AI, and Apiro. I look forward to getting his insights on how AI is reshaping the infrastructure and application layers and economic models of modern software, among other topics I'm sure we'll cover here. Saam, welcome to Technoventure. It's great to see you today.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation, so thank you so much for making time. Maybe we begin with Greylock. As I mentioned at the outset, a storied venture capital firm with a remarkable history. Talk a bit about the firm's focus before we get into your own.
Thanks for the kind introduction. I think for your viewers who may not be familiar, we turned 60 years old last year. So Greylock's one of, if not the oldest venture firm in the US. This is a firm that started on the East Coast, moved to the West Coast in the 2000s. And, in our modern history, the last 20, 25 years or so, we've really done two things exceptionally well. One is consumer internet investing, and we've been lucky to partner with companies like Facebook and Airbnb and Instagram, and more recently, companies like Roblox and Coinbase early on. And then the second is enterprise software. And this firm's history, and I bring this up because it informs how we invest and the types of companies we want to build, has really been built on the foundation of building innovative technology solutions to power the world's largest enterprises, right? Companies like Workday, which started at Greylock's office, or Palo Alto Networks, which also started at Greylock's office, Okta, ServiceNow, more recently companies like Figma and Dropbox. These are the shape and caliber of companies that we look to intersect and sort of intersect at the very, very early stages, often before there's even an idea, certainly before there's a line of code, and then help those entrepreneurs as they build, next generation products and then scale those products into the marketplace. As you mentioned, I focus on the enterprise software side of our practice. And of course, if you think about enterprise software as software that sells to businesses, there are many different ways one could express that. And I'll touch on kind of my focus, but I'll just note as a caveat, that's not all that we do, but certainly sort of primary focus for me. But, I want to be a part of companies that can go on to be a billion, 2 billion, 10 billion in revenue, not in market cap, right? And in order to get to these scales of revenue, you need to have products that can command significant value, which means they're driving significant value to their customers. And then you need to be able to layer on additional modules and additional dimensions of value for your customers over time. And we sort of, when we look at the world very top down, you mentioned, the 20,000 number, and different studies will point to numbers between 20 and 25,000, but there's something like, let's call it 20,000 companies worldwide that do north of $1 billion a year in revenue. Those 20,000 companies control more than 90% of worldwide IT spend. And so if you just think about it very fundamentally, if you're a new entrepreneur and you can build a product that can serve those customers, the amount of IT spend that becomes addressable to you is vast. And what that means is not only can you often land products at very attractive kind of contract sizes, but perhaps more importantly, you're selling to customers who have a large surface area in their business, which means there's lots of problems they have that you can fix with technology. And as you deepen your customer relationship and you continue building out your product suite, you're often able to have multiple products that you sell to the customer, which enable you to sustain really durable growth over many, many years. And if you look at a business like ServiceNow that today has more than 7 distinct product lines, each with $1 billion a year in recurring revenue, some vastly more than $1 billion, that's the shape of business that you can build if you focus on that customer segment. And so that's where we want to focus. And whether that's in cybersecurity and infrastructure software or in application software, there's a lot to go do in this new paradigm shift we're seeing with AI.
Very interesting. And as you think about the entrepreneurs who have the wherewithal to be able to accomplish what you just have noted, talk a bit about the balance between a beginner's mindset, which you've shared with me, is like an important characteristic against, or perhaps in contrast with, or complementing experience, which obviously is a very important thing in thinking about what businesses need, especially having been part of businesses, probably is an important attribute as well. Talk a bit about that balance as you think about what makes for the best entrepreneurs that you find most attractive.
The thing about an exceptional entrepreneur is, by definition, they're exceptional. And there's lots of idiosyncrasies in their backgrounds. I think about the teams we partnered with last year in 2025. We partnered with an enterprise team that's off to a great start. That's founded by four 19, or at the time of our partnership, 19-year-olds. And on the other bookend, we partnered with a company still in stealth where, it's the person's third company and they've had, 30 years of career experience, right? So we see the whole gamut. I think there are a couple of elements that are very important for these entrepreneurs to have in order to be able to build these enterprise-facing companies. One is they have to have a surface area of interaction with the world where they understand the problems these organizations are facing. And perhaps one of the reasons why, certainly historically, the teams that have succeeded in this segment of the market have been on the more experienced side, is because it's hard to know, what problem a Fortune 500 has if you've never interacted with one. Now, again, there can be exceptions. One flavor of exception is if I'm building a developer tool, and I'm building that tool as a young person, I have empathy with that tool. It may be that the form factor I'm building is exactly the form factor that's needed up market. And so in that sense, I do have the empathy for the problem. Another exception we've seen is young people who embed themselves in these organizations. I'm on the board of a company called Cresta. It's a late stage private contact center AI company. When we backed the founder, he was dropping out of the Stanford PhD program, but he took his engineering team, he flew them to Phoenix, where his first customer, Intuit, was running their call center operations, and they rented an Airbnb and just sat at that call center for many months to build that empathy for the problem. So I think there are ways, but so one is like you have to have that kind of domain insight. The second is you have to have the desire to like really go for it. And what I mean by that is you can't build some thin wedge solution off of a $500,000 angel round and expect that global 20,000 accounts are going to trust you to run large parts of their business or IT sort of workflows. Actually, earlier today, I was on Zoom with a really sharp young founder. He wanted to raise $500,000, to go build an AI application company. And the feedback we gave him is we said two things. We said, the good news is we really like you and we really want to see if there's a way to work together. But the even better news is, why don't you take that 500,000? Let's turn that into 6 million, right? Let's make that a much larger number so that you can actually go hire 10, 12 engineers and build an enterprise grade product. So I think there has to be that ambition and understanding that what an enterprise is going to consume has a certain wherewithal, if you will, that's very different than like a solution that's serving something down market. And then I think, and then maybe two more things, right? I think a third piece is the customer centricity and orientation. Like, I think the expectation from larger organizations, there's a mission criticality to which they look at a lot of software they procure, and then an associated expectation around reliability and customer service. And teams just have to understand that, embrace that. And then I'd say the last piece, which skews maybe more towards the beginner's mind or sort of the naivete, is you also can't be too jaded by the way the world currently runs. And often we find with people who are experienced, the downside to experience is incremental thinking and not being willing to go back to first principles and think through really innovative solutions. And I think that's particularly true, sitting here in January 2026, when even just in the last 60 days, the capability curve on the underlying AI models has once again dramatically changed. And if you're not, as a founder, rethinking everything around product, not just the product you build, but around the way you run your company, around the frontier of these kind of capabilities, you're going to get leapfrogged by someone who is. And so that is somewhat of a structural benefit to someone who's younger because they don't have that experience. And so the only lens they have is the first principled lens. Often the Goldilocks, if you will, might be someone who has a bit of that experience, understands the enterprise. Maybe they've done it before, but has that beginner's mind. And we've been fortunate to back a lot of teams like that, even just in the last 24 months.
Very interesting. Given the understandable conservatism at times, certainly among major enterprises, as to what technology to welcome in, what do you see in terms of the any sort of changes in the past decade in terms of major? And I'm asking to paint you to paint with a broad brushstroke, perhaps, but get as specific as you'd like to, of course. In terms of partnering with organizations that may be in an early stage. That you mentioned this in Intuit example, which is a fascinating one. Clearly, the company was not fully loaded and ready to serve them from day one. But Intuit was willing to take a chance and help them learn with them, and actually in the process perhaps influence the product in a way that would suit them best. Talk a bit about what you see as the kinds of companies that are most apt to take a little bit of a risk on organizations that are still in the process of getting up to speed to be able to serve the massive companies you've referred to.
What we've seen over the years at Greylock is there is this sort of distinction in the marketplace where you have, and it seems to be decoupled from size, but you have some large companies where despite the size and maybe they're like, I mean, I won't mention them by name, but I'm even thinking of one large bank where, the CTO of the organization, the whole IT team, you think you're interacting with a Silicon Valley sort of startup team, right? In the sense that they understand that the pace of technology has accelerated to the point where if they wait until things have been really proven out over many years, they will have been leapfrogged, not just by their direct established competitors, but by new entrants into their categories who are building in a technology native or in an AI native way from day one. And so they are actually some of the earliest adopters of technology, right? Intuit's a good example in terms of sort of what they did with Cresta, as one example. But even if you take companies like Anthropic and OpenAI, some of their largest adopters on their API business, rewinding the clock 18 months, were some of the large banks, right? So I think it's more about the culture of the organization. And does the organization understand that not taking risks is actually the biggest form of risk they could be taking? And then, of course, partnering with the right founders, the founders who have that experience, who are backed by the right partners to actually serve the enterprise requirements is smart and in fact actually dramatically reduces the risk. But yeah, and then I think one other thing we've seen, Peter, with this AI wave that I think feels very different to us than prior technology waves, and even one of the benefits of our firm's history is we've had many partners over the years who have seen each of the technology waves, so we're able to kind of learn and pattern match. The speed of adoption around AI is much, much faster. We have different explanations for this. One is that it builds on prior technology waves. Another is that the type of value that you can see is so vastly different than what we've expected from software because of its ability to automate work. But if you take cloud penetration and you think about the speed at which cloud penetration happened in the global 20,000, and the fact that we're still, by many measures, early in the penetration journey, AI is behaving very, very differently. And that's expressing itself through the revenue ramps that we're seeing in our portfolio companies. And so I think there is and maybe it's because all of us see in our personal lives and with our families the impact that ChatGPT and related solutions are having. But there is a proclivity to adopt by the enterprise that is much higher velocity than what we've seen in the past.
You've argued and mentioned to me in past conversations that in the medium term, the majority of compute workloads will be AI workloads. And I wonder, what does that imply for existing enterprise infrastructure stack? Like, how do you see that evolving as a result of that insight?
I think the whole stack is going to evolve. And Peter, I may have shared this anecdote with you, but it was we were in a very interesting board meeting a few weeks ago, and early stage company just in its first year of sales, and we get to the engineering section, and one question that often comes up in these board meetings is, hey, what cloud do we run on, right? Do we run on AWS? Do we run on Azure? Do we run on GCP? So one of the board members asks, hey, by the way, like what cloud do we run on? And the CTO says, we run on Anthropic. And it was the first time we had heard like Anthropic get mentioned, not just in the context of I use the Cloud API for X, or I use Cloud Code to make my developers more productive, but that's the sort of tech stack I've chosen. And to me, that signals, I think that's an early signal of like the shift that's undergoing, which is, I do believe if you take a 5-year view, maybe even sooner than that, the majority of just overall compute workloads are going to be AI workloads. And so then the infrastructure stack is going to have to adapt to serve those workloads. And that positions, and of course, the large hyperscalers will play a role in that world and have terrific services and products in that world. But so do, Anthropic and OpenAI, and so do a whole host of newer technologies that are rethinking each layer of the stack in a purpose-built way for what AI workloads need. So you could just start your way and work your way up, right? You think about the underlying compute layers, the runtimes, storage, observability, all of that is going to get rethought. And I'll give you kind of two examples that we see in our portfolio, not to just pick on our portfolio companies, but to sort of bring some qualitative texture to what I mean. Take observability as an example, right? In a pre-AI world, I would argue observability software, one, was very quantitative and objective, and two, was very focused on the production side of software, not on the development side, because you were looking at things like uptime, was your service running with low latency, these types of very measurable metrics. In an AI world with generative AI, if you think about these models, they're very stochastic, they're non-deterministic. And so you take the same model, you give it the same prompt, 5 times, you get 5 different responses. And so what does it mean for the model to be performant? It's no longer just a question of is the model up, is sort of the latency good, but it's like, is the quality of the response good? And that's inherently, for many cases, a subjective assessment. And so the type of observability tooling you need changes, right? And now it becomes much more focused on, evaluations and sort of these qualitative metrics. And then it shifts from just playing a role in maintaining your production to coming back to your development loop, right? Because, you're a large bank, you deploy a new chatbot to interact with your customers. You want to measure the quality of that chatbot, and then you want to update that chatbot's logic based on what you're saying. And so, for example, we're partners with a company called Braintrust, that's the leading observability provider for these AI workloads, that is really good at these sort of stochastic, non-deterministic generative AI workloads. The same is true, in the database side and on the storage side, right? And you're seeing the rise of different architectures, whether it's the vector database, whether it's systems like ClickHouse that are sort of purpose-built to serve the ways in agents interact with data, which might look very different than human developers or services built by human developers. And so I think that's going to happen up and down the stack, and that is a very big opportunity for new companies. And it also means if I'm a large enterprise, I have to rethink my IT stack and make sure that the stack that I'm investing in can support my desire to transform myself with these AI applications.
Very interesting. You've mentioned, rightfully so, Anthropic a few times in your responses. I mentioned in the introduction that you led the company's investment in that company, consequential organization, obviously. As you think about the race across the major LLMs, it seems as though Anthropic is the one that is becoming kind of the business leader among the major ones. And I wonder if you can, which makes sense given your area of, obviously for them to execute, but given your area of focus, talk a bit about the race across the major LLMs and your own perspectives on where Anthropic stands currently, if you would.
Commenting on the race to start, one of the mistakes, candidly, I think even we had in our thinking early on, as sort of the AI wave took off, and I think when I look at the discussion in the zeitgeist, if you will, I think is a common mistake is to think about the race as a zero-sum race. I think there is this desire to like play out the chessboard and sort of say, okay, this is what the terminal market structure is going to look like, and X company is going to win or Y company is going to win. And the reality is this wave and this shift is so large and we're so early, and it is of such consequence that there will be multiple winners, right? And there will be multiple winners up and down the stack, and you will see us invest in a way that expresses that view. And it's sort of empirically true, because if you look at Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, and what they've done with Gemini, all of them have seen strong growth in their businesses over the last several years. All in some areas they compete, and then in some areas where they have relative differentiation and focus. Anthropic has done a tremendous job across many vectors, but I'd say, I'd call out two in particular as it pertains to this conversation. One is they have really focused on building the world's best models for code. And it turns out code is a very important thing, and in a weird way, like more consequential than we think. Because one, just the applications on top of code are vast, and we could pick numbers, but very, very vast. If you think about how much software development happens today and how much latent development there is for software development that can't get met because we don't have the engineering capacity, right? I mean, I spent my last weekend, leveraging Cloud Code to build some internal tooling at Greylock that makes our lives a little bit more efficient every week. But, we don't have an engineering team, pre-Cloud Code to go staff and sort of go build. But perhaps even more importantly, a lot of things that are not initially thought of as code problems are in fact, I would argue, code problems. And I'll give you an example, which is, you know, so much money gets spent by the large enterprises on implementing their systems of record, doing migrations, doing customizations on top of their Salesforce instances, SAP instances. Many companies spend more money on that work than the underlying software itself. Now, what is that work? That work fundamentally, if you decompose it, is understanding a set of business requirements, mapping those business requirements into custom software and then custom implementation details on top of whether it's SAP, Salesforce, et cetera. It's just a code problem. And so I think what we'll see happen over the next year or two is not just that Anthropic and others models will make developers a lot more productive, they'll make non-developers more productive, but they'll also be able to transform a lot of these business logic and business process problems, model them as code, and then automate them. And so I think Anthropic's focus on code has really paid off for them so far, and like will continue. And then the second thing is, I think and it comes back to even the earlier question you asked around what does it take for entrepreneurs to serve the enterprise? Because they've been so ruthlessly focused on enterprise use cases, they've built a first-class end-to-end organization for servicing the enterprise, right? Their chief commercial officer was previously the president of ServiceNow. They take it very seriously. And as a result, all the enterprises that work with them are able to get to successful outcomes, not just with their first-party products, but with their API business, consistently and quickly.
Super interesting. I appreciate you sharing those perspectives as well. You've talked about the three core use cases for artificial intelligence in the enterprise as coding and code adjacent work. You've just talked a bit about that. Search, chat-driven workflows as well. Talk a bit about, so you've gotten into some of the thesis around the value associated with code and code generation, code augmentation, et cetera. More generally speaking, as you think about as enterprises and technology leaders are driven to prove ROI on investments in artificial intelligence, can you talk a little bit further about how you think about it? There are those, for example, who say, look, some aspects of this are like electricity. No one would ever seek a return on investment figures for the electricity that we use in our operations. But some of these investments are substantial, admittedly decreasing certainly, but substantial nevertheless. And so boards and executive teams are pushing those same tech and digital executives for some kind of proof or evaluation where the value can be derived. What do you point to?
Probably both are true to some degree. Like, if you think about sort of the generic chat use case or the generic search use case, I think all of us who use these tools would say it makes us more productive. Now, it may be harder for me to go measure what is the productivity impact of the fact that I can use Claude or ChatGPT to do diligence on startups and it accelerates my time to getting to an answer on an investment decision. I could try to quantify that. It's probably a little bit more opaque. I think there are ones that, and by the way, that's always been the history of like productivity-oriented software, is it's a little opaque to do precise sort of value attribution. But like, let's say there's the general productivity bucket, and probably the biggest one there is just the generic chat tools. I think on the more use case focused ones, and I'd say code is a great example, things that are derivative of chat, like customer support or some of the vertical things happening around legal workflow automation or medical workflow automation. I actually think that's what's so beautiful about these use cases, and part of why we're seeing them get adopted so quickly, and the associated companies grow so fast, which is they all have this characteristic where you can directly connect the model and the product to work that's being automated and sort of an ROI or efficiency calculus, right? So for example, Cresta, the company I mentioned in the contact center AI space, they go to their customers and show their customers what their customers are spending on the average, sort of case resolution, and then what they're able to spend with Cresta, and there's a meaningful multiple of savings there, right? The same is sort of true with these legal tools where you can take a redlining use case and think about what you would spend on sort of a services fee if you outsource that to a law firm. And then if you're using one of these AI tools, you're able to do that redlining for a fraction of the cost. So I think that's what we like about these use cases. And I would actually say that's why these use cases have been able to grow so fast, because teams are able to go justify to their CEOs and their boards very hard ROI calculus. But I also just want to say that I think cost is not alone enough. And we tell entrepreneurs, the moment that your entire value calculus is based on cost savings, the good news is you have a fast insertion point in, and the bad news is someone's going to come in and undercut you next year when the renewal comes up. And I think customers have to think about it the same way. The thing about AI is it doesn't just change the cost, it changes the whole effectiveness of the workflow. And we often use that framing at Greylock. There's efficiency and there's effectiveness. And yeah, there's a lot of efficiency to be had, but the effectiveness is even more interesting. So in the code case, the efficiency would be I can take this migration work that I'm doing and I've outsourced to a development shop and I can bring it in-house and I can cut the cost by 50%. That's an awesome win. But the effectiveness would be I can go unlock users that are non-technical to build their own internal applications to make them more productive in a way that was never possible before. Or in the context of the contact center, the efficiency is I can go automate all these case resolutions. The effectiveness is it turns out these AIs are a lot better at many things than you and I are. And so they can, take a customer's calling into Verizon to cancel the call and actually turn that into a renewal or an upsell opportunity, more of a revenue generating opportunity. And so, that's the next level for these things is maybe you land with efficiency and maybe that's how the customer rationalizes the solution to begin. But over time, you begin pushing at new forms of effectiveness that were not possible before because of what AIs are uniquely good at relative to humans.
You and I recently had a conversation also about progress related to agentic AI, and I was sharing some anecdotes from my ecosystem, at least, where people are excited about the possibilities of agentic AI, and many of them anyway, not all of them, of course, but many of them feel as though it's not yet ready for prime time. You made the very important point that you wait just a few weeks and it's remarkable the progress you can make. So don't part of your advice even to me was, don't become so set in that perspective, not to check back in and check back in frequently. Talk a bit about where things stand from your perspective in the ongoing evolution of agentic AI and what excites you most about it.
It's one of, there's like, I'm paraphrasing, but there's this, I forget who said it, but some infamous investor said humans are really bad at understanding exponential curves, right? And I think we're like living in an exponential curve right now, and like we're all in the day-to-day figuring out ways to kind of take advantage of this. We've got to like zoom out and realize like we're still early, and by nature, like the curve is changing very, very quickly. So, the way I think about it is we're sitting now in Jan 2026. We're a little more than just 3 years post ChatGPT coming out, right? And I think for many of us, it's even hard to remember the world pre-ChatGPT, but it's only been about 3 years, right? Now, reasoning, right, and the ability for these models to reason and make decisions, which obviously underpins agents and agentic work, reasoning really didn't become a thing until late 2024 when OpenAI to start released their O1 series of models, and then the other labs released their competing models. So we're something like 14 months, 14 to 15 months since the like launch of reasoning as a first class kind of focus area by these labs. And then we're probably, 90 days since the most recent cohort of kind of frontier models with Claude Opus 4.5 and Gemini 3 and OpenAI's GPT-5. And it's really not until that class of models that multi-step sort of long horizon reasoning has become robust and capable. And it's sort of what I mean by that for listeners who haven't heard that term before is sort of, imagine an agent that needs to do a 100-step process. And imagine for each step, there's some probability it gets it right. Well, as you elongate the process and you begin multiplying these probabilities, the odds that the agent breaks down, of course, balloon. And most high value use cases for agents in the enterprise are not just do this one thing. It's like do this sequence of many things. And so when people talk about long horizon agents becoming more robust, what they mean is agents' abilities to traverse many steps with high robustness and either get each step correct or when it makes an error, have the awareness and the ability to learn from that error and then adjust. That is like, Peter, like literally in the last 90 days, the underlying models have even become possible. And so now you've got to like play that forward on like, okay, a bunch of startup teams have got to go adopt that and refactor their solutions and kind of connect that capability to whatever customer problem they're focused on. And so it wouldn't surprise me if I was a technology leader at a large enterprise, if today my answer was, hey, I don't really see any agents working in my environment. But I think the mistake would be to conclude that even in mid 2026, that'll still be the case, right? Because the underlying capabilities are just shifting so fast. And actually, one thing when I talk to friends who lead technology teams at large organizations, one piece of advice I share is if you tried a use case and it failed, go back and try it again. And you might want to even consider doing that every 6 months because the use cases that were failing 6 months ago may not be failing today.
Good wisdom to share, certainly, and it makes a lot of sense given the pace of change, and always good to get that reminder as how early we are really in the grand scheme of things in terms of its continued evolution, and yet the remarkable progress that continues to be marshaled in on a day-to-day basis. I wonder, as you think about from a macro perspective, the broader impact that this will have on our economy here in the U.S. and perhaps more broadly speaking, and surely, of course, some roles are going to be roles within companies' jobs are going to be fundamentally changed or will go away. There has always been this sort of a tension, of course, and then new roles, of course, come online. Is there anything about the pace of the change as you just described, and is surely so, that has you concerned about an imbalance between those as you think about the macro perspective here?
I'm sort of structurally an optimist, and both it's hard to be a venture capitalist without being an optimist, and I think life's more pleasant being an optimist. And so I take I overall take the optimistic view, which is sort of, and by the way, I read a very good book, which I'll recommend to you, Peter, and also your listeners, a book called Engines That Move Markets, and it's a fantastic book that talks about goes back and looks at many of the large technology transitions, right? Dating back to the Industrial Revolution, right? Of course, the internet. And I found that like context to be very helpful, telephony. And I found that context to be really helpful for what we are maybe going to see happen over the coming years and decades. And so I take the optimistic view that I think sort of writ large, humans are long past kind of the foundational layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we will create new forms of work and creativity and ingenuity and things that we can't even anticipate today. Just like 20 years ago, no one would have anticipated that being a social media influencer would be a way that you could have a career. But I think the short term is going to be pretty rocky, right? And I'm seeing a lot of dispersion between people who understand how to use these tools and people who don't. And by the way, like one of the interesting framings I'd share, Peter, is like, if you paused models, right? You said no more improvement, no more research, and you just took like what's in the models today, you could argue we already have quote unquote AGI. AGI is ill-defined, which is why I say quote unquote. But like these things are unbelievably powerful. And the limit between, the gap between where like their true intrinsic capability is today and the fact that like not all of our lives feel totally different yet is like an engineering, a context, and a process problem. It's not a scientific or research problem. And the reality is the applications are just immature, dating back to what I said, which is like these capabilities are so new that we just haven't had enough time for the application cycle to play out. And so some individual developers have learned how to model their minds and their businesses and their code bases in a way where they never even touch code anymore. Cloud Code's writing everything. And then others use Cloud Code and they're like, hey, this isn't that good. But it's the same Cloud Code. It's because there's a variance in capability on how to use this, right? And the same is true by any profession, physicians, lawyers, salespeople. And so I think you as an individual need to push yourself to learn how to adapt your work and the context to the way AI and agents are sort of understand and are good at interacting. And when you do that, you'll see much more effectiveness. And the individuals and the organizations who do that versus those who don't, there may be a 10x spread. And I think that's going to be great for some people and unfortunate for others. And then I think the other thing is we are going to see some real job displacement, right? And I think, I pick on customer support because it's an easy one to pick on because the models are pretty good at it today. But it is inconceivable to me that the headcount worldwide doing support a decade from now will be in the zone of what it is today. Now, I'm optimistic that a bunch of those folks will be able to reskill and go work on more interesting things. But in the long run, that will play out. In the short run, it will be sort of messy.
Given the answer you just mentioned, I can't help but ask, how have you adapted your work to where AI and agents can add more value? How has your work changed? How have you incorporated it into your workflows in ways that add value?
I'll tell you a few things we're working on, and I would say we are. I would give us a B grade in the sense that I think we could be much further along than we are. And actually, we just created our firm goals for the year. To to kick off the year. And our number one goal was by the end of 2026, we want to be the most AI native venture capital firm in the world, right? And so we're taking it very seriously. And in fact, we're even going to hire several engineers to just, or vibe coders, if you will, to sit alongside us and work with us to transform every aspect of what we do. But I'll give you a few examples of things we focused on so far. The first is, as a venture capital firm, our core product is high quality decisions, right? We meet several thousand companies a year and we invest in 8 to 10. And every year we look back and of course there were terrific companies that we saw and we had the chance to partner with and we foolishly elected not to. And so we obsess with how do we not make that mistake again? And humans are great decision makers in some ways, but imperfect in other ways, right? Two common biases is one, we all rewrite history. And so whether we made a good decision or a bad decision 3 years ago, we don't really do a good job of remembering kind of what the decision state was at the time of decision. And then the second is, we can only load so much context in our minds at once. It turns out models have a lot of deficiencies relative to humans, but they're very good at reasoning over long amounts of context, and they're completely unemotional. And so we are actually in process of building and have been prototyping an AI investor that literally sits in our investment committee. And when we have investment committee meetings at Greylock, we transcribe all of them. So all of them are recorded and transcribed. And let's say, Peter, you're an entrepreneur, you're pitching us. We spend an hour with you. You leave, and we'll spend 30 minutes, right, debating your company. And this AI agent sits alongside us. It's listening to that debate, and then at the end, it actually opines. In addition to giving its investment recommendation, it also specifically calls out, for example, hey, Greylock team, I'm hearing you say that you have this question on market size around this, and you're thinking about passing. By the way, the last time you had this question, you made a bad decision. You passed on this company and you ended up regretting that pass. And so it's this sort of very neutral, non-emotional thought partner to us. And early days, but I'm actually I believe that this will lead to us making much better decisions. So that's one example. Another that I use is, I have an executive coach who I interact with about once a month, and he's amazing, and I get a lot of value out of him. What I wish is that he sat with me 24/7 and watched everything I did and gave me in real time coaching. Unfortunately, that's not possible, but it is possible with AI. And so, for example, I spend a lot of my time doing interviews of candidates to join our portfolio companies, and these are critical decisions because if we pick the right founders in the right markets, then the only thing that matters is can we bring the best people into the company. And I have whole interview frameworks, right? But I ask the candidate if I can use a note taker, an AI note taker in the meeting. It enables me to be more present. And then at the end of every meeting, I get a report back. I call it my AI coach from my AI coach that I've given it some logic around how I should approach interviews. And then it tells me, hey, Saam, you came into this meeting with this candidate, and the big question was, it's a marketing person. They know how to do product marketing, but they don't know how to do demand gen. And you were weak at asking questions, and you didn't really drill down to ascertain that. And here's how you could have asked the question even better. It's been an amazing improvement for me, Peter. And actually, that's one tip, to be very tactical, I'd give you and others listening. AI is very good at critiquing. And so if you take anything you're doing and you pass it to any LLM and you say, be a really, model yourself as the world's best executive coach, be a really harsh critic and tell me things I don't want to hear about high performance in this context, you'll be stunned. And we all have the abilities to now have these AI coaches with us at all times, and just we can all accelerate our own learning and development. So those are two examples of how I'm using it, Peter. But I think I have a long list in my Notion docs of things I want to experiment with this year.
Yeah, you have the tremendous advantage of meeting so many working with great bright people at Greylock, but of course, having so many people come through your offices or through virtual meetings who will change the world. And I'm sure it gives you a perspective on the skills on the rise, roles that are more or less important. You're now a father as well, as am I, and so it gives you a different context for some of the thinking about what might be more important a decade or two from now as it becomes relevant for your daughter. I think it's a daughter you have, yes?
Yes, good memory.
I wonder, how do you think about that? How has that changed from when you were 18, let's say, and the kinds of opportunities that were attractive to you? If for somebody who's an 18-year-old today, what would you advise them that might be different from the advice you took and followed successfully when you were 18?
It's interesting because I was talking to a very well-known technology leader a week ago, and he told me something like his kids are older than mine. They're about to enter college. And he said, I told my kids, there's only one major you can't do, which is computer science, right? And this is, by the way, someone who has a PhD in computer science. And so, of course, like this comment had sort of a profound impact on me, and I was reflecting on it. And I actually feel like I disagree with him, right? And I disagree with him because I think that the way to model AI is it's a new form of leverage, right? We have had, capital as leverage, we've had labor as leverage. I think what we all have access to now, and certainly our kids will have access to, is infinite intelligence. Elastic intelligence. You'll be able to scale a team of 1,000 programmers, 1,000 cloud code agents working in parallel. But still fundamentally, so that's the good news. But for you to be able to take advantage of that leverage, I think all the critical thinking, system design, and I don't just mean that in a technical sense, system design and system architecture, it could be organizational design and organizational architecture. I actually think that thinking becomes more important in the gains, if you will, to be had to the people who are phenomenal at that will dramatically amplify because they'll be able to take that insight and then apply much more leverage against it. And the people who are just good at the rote work, if you will, sort of will become irrelevant. And so I actually think and I say this as a computer science major, in my undergraduate, like, yeah, is it important that I know how to do JavaScript versus Python? Like, probably less important. It's important that I understand the principles of object-oriented design and how to decompose an application into services and how those services should interact. I actually think it's like profoundly important because if I make those decisions correctly now, I can leverage AI to do sort of everything, all the rote work. But if I don't make those decisions correctly, all that rote work will be for nothing. And so I would say, like, my daughter's 18 months old and just getting started. But I think the critical thinking and kind of first principles reasoning are very, very important skills. And by the way, one anecdote, I work with a company, actually it's Brain Trust, the observability company I mentioned. The founder of the company is truly a 100x engineer. I mean, he's unlike anybody I've worked with just as an engineer. And he told me, he said, Saam, one day a week, I don't use any AI tools in my work. And I was sort of stunned, right? Because this is someone who like lives in the AI tools. And he said, it is so important to me that I maintain that first principle kind of thinking and reasoning. The analogy he gave me is if you overly rely on a GPS, you forget your sense of direction, and then you're without a GPS and you don't know where to go. And the point is not because that means, you're planning for this day where this AI tool gets taken away from you. That's not the case, but it's because that underlying reasoning and keeping that muscle strong is what's going to enable you to continue to be effective and stand out.
Yeah, what an interesting anecdote. Thank you for sharing, and thanks for sharing your own perspectives, of course, as well. You mentioned Engines That Move Markets, a book that you recommend. I wonder, are there other resources that you leverage, books you love, podcasts that you listen to, other research or blogs that you would recommend to others that you use to stay current?
It's an important time to, like, the things are changing so fast, staying current is very important. Let's see. Let me think for a moment. I really like Dorkesh's podcast. I think he's an amazing interviewer and he brings on really good thinkers in AI. I listen to everything that people from the large labs put out because I do believe that, like, the folks inside the large labs do see the world a bit more clearly than any of us outside. So, for example, this week was obviously Davos. Multiple of, including the Anthropic CEO, Demis from DeepMind, we're at Davos, and there are several interviews I'd recommend people listen. It's just very interesting what they think is going to happen, and I think Dario at Anthropic has been remarkably accurate on his predictions. He also writes amazing long form pieces that I read. So that would be my main recommendation, which is like the content that and the interviews and the writing that comes from the people at the labs. They have the best intuition for where the technology is going, and I try to read as much of it as I can to try to build that intuition myself.
That makes sense. Well, Saam, thank you so much for a wide-ranging and fascinating conversation, certainly underscoring the remarkable role that you have and the great perspectives that you have. I appreciate you sharing some of those with me here today.